Sí, se escucha bien.
Okay, excellent. Okay.
Jenny,
Sí.
Jenny, ¿es posible escuchar esa clase después? No es que yo tengo una reunión ahora también a las 6:30.
Ok, la voy a grabar, de hecho.
Así, porfa, para poder escucharla.
¿Está bien?
¿Y dónde me meto para...?
Yo les paso después la grabación a los directores, entonces vos la pedís.
Ah, bueno, está bien, muchas gracias.
Ok, excelente.
Chao, yo me tengo que salir porque tengo una reunión. Gracias.
Ok, está bien. Okay, perfect. Okay, guys, let me share my screen with you. Can you see my screen now? Yes?
Yes.
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 Okay, excellent.
Speaking screen.
Okay. Adverbs of frequency. Do you have any idea, guys, what are those? Have you heard that phrase before, adverbs of frequency?
Yes, teacher.
Why are they good for? Why are they important?
Because the adverbs of frequency
Tell me.
okay, describe actions that happen.
Exactly. Basically, an adverb of frequency describes how often an action happens. How often or how often. ¿Qué tan a menudo sucede algo? Okay. There are 6 main adverbs of frequency that we use in English. Those are always, usually, or normally. We can also say generally. There are several ways to say usually. And listen to the pronunciation, guys. Usually, usually, normally, or regularly. Often, we can pronounce it in both ways too. Often or often, both are okay. Sometimes, rarely. Let's pay attention to the pronunciation of this word. Rarely, rarely. We do not pronounce the E. Rarely and never. Those are the main adverbs of frequency. Let's go over the meaning. Always. Always is basically 100% of the times. Usually 80% of the times. Often or often 70% of the times. Sometimes 50% of the times. Rarely 20% of the times. And never 0% of the times. These percentages, guys, are so you can have an idea more or less how often the situation takes place. Here we have another percentage chart. Always 100% of the times. That is to say, all of the time. To say always is the same as to say all of the time. What about usually? Usually is like saying most of the time. La mayoría del tiempo. Todo el tiempo, always, usually, la mayoría del tiempo. Often or often is like much of the time. Mucho del tiempo. Sometimes is like some of the time. Seldom. Seldom is another way to say rarely. So rarely and seldom are synonyms. Seldom, rarely mean almost never. And never, not at any time. Not at any time. So 0% of the times. Do you have any questions regarding the meaning of the adverbs of frequency?
No, teacher.
No? Okay.
No, I don't have.
Okay, let's see some examples. Adverbs of frequency tell us how often. Los adverbios de frecuencia nos dicen qué tan a menudo, cada cuánto. Okay, how about someone helps me to read the first sentence, the first example?
He never plays the guitar.
Exactly, thank you, Susanna. He never plays the guitar. What about the second one?
He rarely visits the dentist.
He rarely visits the dentist. Exactly. Next one.
They sometimes
some
go to the cities.
Seaside. Seaside. They sometimes go to the seaside. Okay, and the last one?
She always goes jogging.
Okay, she always goes jogging. Excellent.
And
He-
teacher, what's the meaning of seaside?
Seaside es como decir en la costa.
Okay,
Mhm.
thank you.
Okay, good. So let's go over the position of the adverbs of frequency. The position of the adverbs of frequency with the other verbs, and by the other verbs, I mean verbs that are different from to be. Remember, we have basically just two groups in English of verbs, the verb to be and the other verbs, the verbs different from be or other than be. So the position of this adverbs of frequency with verbs that are not to be, they usually or generally come immediately before the base verb. Or if you want to see it, we place them before the subject and the verb. For example, we generally go to the cinema on Tuesdays. He doesn't always tell the truth. They sometimes arrive late. As you can see in all of these sentences, we have the adverb of frequency between the subject and the main verb. Between the subject and the main verb. Same time here, between the subject and the main verb. But there is a very important note here. However, in spoken English, you will find them in other positions too. In spoken English, as it says here, you don't follow the rules as in grammar. So they can place the adverb of frequency in another position. For example, generally they put sometimes at the beginning of the sentence. Sometimes I feel sad. Or sometimes he forgets things. Okay, so just for you to keep it in mind that in spoken English, sometimes is often at the beginning of a sentence. You may also, guys, find it at the end. You can also say, I feel sad sometimes, I sometimes feel sad, or sometimes I feel sad. We have a small practice. Let's practice here, guys. For example, Mary drinks milk all of the time. All of the time is like saying always. Mary always drinks milk. John drinks milk most of the time. Most of the time is the same as saying usually. Maybe we can go back a little bit. Maybe you can take notes. Always, all of the time. Usually, most of the time. Often, much of the time. Sometimes, some of the time. Seldom, almost never. And never, not at any time. Did you have them?
Yes, teacher, but I have a question. What's the difference between most and much?
Okay,
this
most. Okay, most es la mayoría del tiempo, la mayoría de las veces. Y en much es muchas, muchas veces. So there's a little bit of a difference entre muchas veces o la mayoría de las veces. La mayoría es un poquito más que muchas veces. Is that clear?
Yes,
Sí. Okay.
thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So here we go. Let's see. Number 1, who wants to give it a try? John drinks coffee some of the time. What adverb of frequency can we use in that sentence? Some of the time.
Sometimes.
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 Exactly.
Sometimes.
So how do we say the new sentence?
Sometimes John drinks coffee.
Exactly. You can say sometimes John drinks coffee, or you can say
John drinks
John
coffee sometimes.
sometimes drinks coffee. Exactly. Or John drinks coffee sometimes.
Sometimes.
Perfect. What about number 2? He almost never drinks tea. What adverb of frequency can we use there?
Rarely,
Rarely. Mhm.
rarely.
Okay, can you make the whole sentence, please?
He rarely drinks tea.
Excellent. He rarely drinks tea. What about number 3? Mr. Allen drinks coffee much of the time. Much of the time.
Mr. Allen
Often.
drinks often.
Okay, exactly. Mr. Allen often drinks coffee. Exactly. Mr. Allen often drinks coffee. Remember, you can say often or often, and both are correct. What about number 4? Mrs. Allen almost never drinks coffee. Oh, no, I'm
Seldom.
sorry. Yeah,
Seldom.
seldom. Mhm. Okay, number 5. She drinks tea most of the time.
Usually.
Usually. Usually. Exactly. So Mrs. Allen usually drinks coffee. Perfect. What about number 5?
She drinks tea.
Number 6.
Yes.
Teacher, excuse me, but
Yep.
in the sentence when said almost never is the inverse.
Yes, is seldom, seldom or rarely. Almost
Alright.
never is casi nunca. Exactly. So
Right.
almost never, yeah, it's like saying seldom or rarely. Perfect.
Teacher.
Uh-huh.
Sit is always.
Always,
Yes.
all the time.
Mr. Miller
That's
always,
it.
Siempre, siempre.
Number 6.
Mr. Miller always
Exactly,
has coffee
exactly.
at
Yes. That is for number 6, exactly. Yes, Mr. Miller always, perfect, has coffee at 10 a.m. Okay, what about number 7, guys?
Usually.
Some of the time.
Always.
No, some of the time.
Sometimes.
Sometimes, exactly. So what do we say? Mrs.
Mrs.
Miller.
Miller has
Yes.
coffee at 10 a.m. sometimes. Or sometimes
Okay.
Mrs. Miller
Has coffee at 10 a.m.
has, yes, has coffee at 10
Exactly.
a.m.
Exactly. Sí, entonces con sometimes es el único que lo podemos poner en cualquier lado, ya sea al principio, en la posición usual, que es
Usual.
entre el sujeto y el verbo, o al final. Sí, entonces en la 7, number 7, we can say sometimes Mrs. Miller has coffee at 10 a.m. or Mrs. Miller sometimes has coffee at 10 a.m. or Mrs. Miller has coffee at 10 a.m. sometimes. Perfect. What about number 8, guys? Almost never. What is the meaning of almost never?
Seldom.
Seldom, yes, or rarely. So what do we say here?
Rarely.
Mrs. Miller.
Seldom.
Seldom. Or
Seldom
Mrs.
never.
Miller. Rarely. No, we have to eliminate never. Almost never is the same as saying seldom or rarely.
Sí. Drinks.
So, exactly, Mrs. Miller seldom drinks milk in the morning, or Mrs. Miller rarely drinks milk in the morning. What about 9? Tell me.
Buenas tardes, teacher. Entré un poco tarde porque pensé que era en otra plataforma. ¿Me puedes decir cómo es la dinámica? Discúlpeme.
Ah, ok, estamos estudiando los adverbios de frecuencia, que son always, siempre, sometimes, a veces, como el 70%. Ok, let me go back a little. Always, siempre, usually, generalmente, o la mayoría del tiempo, often, a menudo o muchas veces, sometimes, algunas veces, seldom o rarely, casi nunca, y never, nunca, not at any time. Entonces estamos practicando esos adverbios de frecuencia. Su posición, por ejemplo, estamos diciendo que es con los otros verbos que no son to be, o sea, con un verbo diferente a to be, los vamos a poner entre el sujeto y el verbo, excepto sometimes. Sometimes es el único adverbio de frecuencia que podemos poner ya sea al principio, en medio del sujeto y el verbo o al final de la oración. Entonces, eso es lo que estamos practicando. Estamos cambiando, en este caso, las frases de tiempo por el adverbio de frecuencia correcto. All of the time, todo el tiempo es igual a decir always. Por ejemplo, Mary drinks milk all of the time is the same as saying Mary always drinks milk.
Muchas
John,
gracias.
drinks milk most of the time. So it's the same as saying John usually drinks milk. Okay, we were in number 9, right?
Yes.
Okay, who can help me with number 9?
She usually has coffee in the morning.
She usually has coffee in the morning. What about 10?
Usually too. Usually.
Sometimes. Exactly, sometimes. So what do we say?
Sometimes Mr. and Mrs. Miller eat in a restaurant.
Exactly, there, exactly. Sometimes Mr. and Mrs. Miller eat in a restaurant. Or Mr. and Mrs. Miller sometimes eat in a restaurant. Or Mr. and Mrs. Miller eat in a restaurant sometimes. Excellent. What about 11?
John always eats in restaurant.
Excellent. What about 12?
Mary Sheldon is in the restaurant.
Okay, excellent. Mary seldom eats in a restaurant. Okay, excellent. What about 13?
Sometimes.
Usually at home. She usually is
Yes, she usually eats at home. And what about 14?
often.
Often Mr. and Mr. Allen eat in restaurant.
Exactly. Mr. and Mrs. Allen often eat in a restaurant. Okay, perfect. Now, guys, with the verb to be, the position of this adverb of frequency is going to be different. This is what we have been doing so far with verbs other than to be. Remember, we place them between the subject and the verb. However, the new pattern with the verb to be is we have the subject, the verb to be, and then the adverb of frequency. Entonces, otra vez, con todos los verbos que son diferentes al verbo to be, vamos a poner ese adverbio de frecuencia entre el sujeto y el verbo, excepto con sometimes, ¿verdad? Que puede ser al principio, en medio o al final. Pero con el verbo to be, vamos a poner esos adverbios de frecuencia después del verbo to be. Mary is always. Or she is always. Or he is never. Or he is often, etc. Adverbs like always, single word adverbs of frequency, come after forms of be. So we place them after am, after as, after are, and after is. Is that clear? ¿Estamos claros ahí?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, teacher.
Yeah.
Perfect. So let's
Yes.
practice then. Let's practice then. John is busy all of the time. Same idea. So we say John is always busy. Mr. Allen is busy most of the time. So we have to say Mr. Allen is usually busy. Okay, let's give it a try with number 1. Mrs. Allen is busy much of the time. How do we say this with an adverb of frequency?
Mr. Allen is
Often.
always busy.
Okay, Mrs. Allen is often busy or usually busy. Exactly. Yes. What about number 2? She's tired some of the time.
She is sometimes tired.
She is sometimes tired. Exactly. Susanna, do you have a question?
No, thanks.
Okay.
Teacher, I have a question.
Tell me.
In this case, we use sometimes similar than the other case, or is different?
No, it's the same. You can say sometimes she's tired, or she is sometimes tired, or she's tired sometimes.
Okay.
Yes, it's the same. Perfect. What about number 3, guys? Mr. Miller is almost never tired.
Mr. Miller is seldom never tired.
Is seldom tired.
Seldom tired. Exactly, sin el never. El almost never, toda la frasecita la cambiamos por seldom. Seldom. Y la palabra seldom la pronunciamos con S. Seldom. Seldom. Exactly. Seldom.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect. What about number 4?
I made a mistake with that word.
Okay, yeah, but don't worry. We're here to learn. Yes.
Okay.
Teacher, la 4 is usually.
Usually, yes, exactly. So,
Mr. Miller is usually thirsty.
Thirsty, sediento, yes. Mr. Miller is usually thirsty. What about number 5?
Sometimes.
Okay,
He is
¿cómo diríamos?
hungry.
He is sometimes hungry.
Exactly, he is sometimes hungry, or sometimes he's hungry, or he's hungry sometimes. Sometimes, como preguntaba la compañera, sí, es igual que nosotros los verbos, puede ser al principio, después de to be o al final. What about number 6? John is hungry much of the time.
Often.
Yes. So what do we say?
John is often hungry.
Perfect. What about 7? He's thirsty most of the time.
Usually.
Usually, yes. So what do we say?
Usually thirsty.
He's usually thirsty. Perfect. Next. 8. He's almost never in the room. Almost never is saying seldom or rarely. So what do we say?
Seldom in the room.
Exactly. He is seldom in the room. Okay, what about number 9?
He is usually at home.
Perfect. 10.
Sometimes Mr. Allen is at home.
Perfect. 11.
Usually.
Usually, yes.
Allen is usually right.
Perfect. Next. 12.
Never.
Rarely.
Seldom.
Exactly.
rarely.
So he's seldom wrong or he's rarely wrong. 13.
Rarely. 13.
Usually.
Usually, yeah. So Mr. and Mrs. Allen are usually happy.
Usually happy.
Happy. And 14, the last one?
Seldom. They are
Seldom.
sad.
Exactly. They are seldom sad. Easy Japanese. Very easy. Okay, let's see the question form. To make questions about frequency, we normally use how often. So when we want to know how regularly someone does something, we ask with how often. ¿Qué tan a menudo? ¿Cada cuánto? O cada tanto? For example, how often do you watch films? How often does she play tennis? How often do the trains arrive late? But it's also possible to ask questions simply with an adverb of frequency. For example, do you often come here? Does she always work so hard? Do they ever pay on time? In this case, we use ever in a question instead of never. Okay, so don't use never in a question, but instead use ever. Okay. Do you often? Does she always? So in this case, as you can see, if we're gonna use the adverbs of frequency in a question other than how often, we also place them between the subject and the main verb. Do you often? Does she always? Do they ever? Whenever we have a modal verb or an auxiliary, we're going to place them after the auxiliary. For example, you must always try your best. We can usually find a seat on our train. They should never be rude to customers. Okay, so whenever we have an adverb, a modal adverb or an auxiliary verb, we place them after the auxiliary verb or after the modal. The same rule, yes, as I told you, applies for auxiliary verbs. I have never visited Turkey. He's always taking things from my desk. It's really annoying. You had rarely arrived late at work until yesterday.
Teacher,
Yes?
what is the difference between modal and auxiliary?
Actually, it's basically the same. We can call them just auxiliaries or modal auxiliaries to the ones that are like can, should, would, could. However, auxiliary verbs can also be like be and have and do. That is the only difference. But otherwise, those other can, could, should, would, those you can call them modals or auxiliaries, or even modal auxiliaries.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, guys. Quick exercise here. Let's match each how often question to its answer. Okay, question number 1. How often do you eat breakfast? What is the correct answer? A, B, C, or D?
B.
Okay, can you read it? How often do you eat breakfast?
I never eat it because I'm never hungry in the morning.
Perfect. What about number 2? How often do you do your homework?
D.
D.
I always do it because I am a good student.
Perfect. Excellent. What about number 3? How often do you walk to school?
Number C.
Letter C.
Letter C.
Okay. Can you read it?
I sometimes do it, but if it rains, I take the bus.
Excellent. And the last one. How often do you do exercise?
With 8, I usually play sports 3 times a week.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty, guys. Any questions or was it pretty clear?
It's very clear.
Excellent.
It's clear for me.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's clearly.
Great. Alrighty, guys. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate you coming to this class. I hope you learned it very well, and I wish you a great weekend.
Thanks a lot.
Sure. Take care, guys.
Thank you. Good
See
night.
ya.
Sure.
Bye.
I have a question.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay,
Yeah, thank
bye-bye.
you for
Teacher,
class.
Okay.
sorry, the next class, what is the date, the next class?
Oh, they'll let you know through chat. For the next, you mean for the next master class?
Huh?
Yes, I don't have it right now. I think it's not set up yet. Todavía creo que no está seteada. Cuando sea, ellos les mandan la fecha. Generalmente es como un mes a partir de hoy.
Teacher, ¿usted me podría
Una
compartir
preguntita.
las dos
Esta
clases
clase
anteriores del
estaba
master
haciendo
class?
grabada. ¿Me la voy a pasar, profesora?
Ok, un momentito. Tengo dos preguntas a la vez.
Hola.
Sí, un momento. Primero que todo, las otras dos las pueden pedir en servicio al cliente. Ellos se las pasan.
Muchas gracias.
Sí, ¿cuál fue
Ay,
la otra
gracias.
pregunta?
Sí, que como está siendo grabada, me la pueden pasar.
Ah, sí, claro. Ustedes la piden en servicio al cliente.
Gracias.
Ok, alrighty.
Teacher, una pregunta. Las presentaciones ¿usted las pasa o cómo se hace para obtenerlas?
Sí,
Digamos,
las
no,
piden en
no la
servicio al cliente.
grabación, digamos, no la grabación en sí, sino las presentaciones.
Como el PDF, perdón,
Ajá.
el
PowerPoint.
El PowerPoint, sí, yo les paso las dos cosas a ellos, entonces usted pide lo que quiere, si la grabación o el PowerPoint.
Teacher, una consulta, ¿cuánto
Gracias.
dura el módulo? O sea, ¿cuánto dura la beca en realidad?
Para eso mejor preguntar en servicio al cliente, porfa.
Muy bien, excelente. Te
Muchas
agradezco.
gracias, profe.
Con mucho gusto,
Thank you.
muchachos, que estén
Thank
bien.
you for that.
Alrighty, you're
Goodbye.
very welcome. Bye.
Thanks, teacher. Good night.
Bye.
All.
Bye. Chicos, una cosa,
Bye.
good night no es una despedida. Good night
Okay.
decimos cuando nos vamos a ir a acostar o si nos vamos muy tarde de algún lugar.
Good evening.
Good evening, exactly, sí.
Good evening.
Pueden decir good evening, sí, o si no, usan otra despedida. See you later.
Bye,
Bye
teacher.
bye, exactly.
I see you the next
Alrighty.
class.
Sure, hopefully.
Okay.
Bye,
I'll see you
teacher.
later, teacher.
Alrighty, bye bye, take
See you
care.
later,
Bye.
teacher. Thank you for
Laters.
that.
Sure.